Okay, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Gary Varner's complicated essay, Can Animal Rights Activists Be Environmentalists? I think it's a very interesting, great argument. And let's just talk about how this relates to what I think is one of the most important things people should really understand about our country and about how people argue, and that's wedge politics. I'm making this video about wedge politics, but it's really about talking about Varner's essay, which is a direct response to Peter Singer's ideas about the animal rights that you just read. So, um, can animal rights activists be environmentalists? That question, at the heart of that, is wedge politics and an attempt to wedge people against one another. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But first, we have to talk about this idea that Gary Varner is looking for a consensus-seeking pragmatist. Consensus, as you know, means that you find where people agree with one another and can agree to do things a certain way or to act in a certain way or do something for a certain cause. That's what we think of when we try to find consensus with people. And a pragmatist is obviously somebody who tries to do something in a pragmatic way, in a way that will work, in a way that isn't theoretical but is practical. So, and I ask you this question: should ordinary people be able to follow an argument like Varner's or Singer's? And I think my answer to that is yes, because these kinds of decisions are being made all the time that they're talking about in these two essays. You know, do you work to uphold a species, or do you think instead about the individual animal and its suffering or its continuing life? So one of the things that Varner is also talking about in this essay is the difference between philosophy and a bumper sticker. Bumper stickers work in a very certain way. They make a very brief claim and they don't fill it out. You don't get a chance to stop and talk to somebody when you read their bumper sticker. You read it, you decide whether you agree with them or not, and think highly of them or think poorly of them if you don't, and that's the way it works. The reason why he's talking about this is, and he talks about truncating and radicalizing someone's argument. The easiest way for me to explain what he means by that to you is to look at an actual tree. And when we say something is truncated, I mean, you can think of it in these terms. It means that you cut the branches off, right? So this would be just the trunk up through here. That's what we say. Something is truncated, it's shortened, it's made smaller. So you're cutting off. So if you think of the tree as an argument, and here are the roots, the base of the argument. This is what the principles upon which a person operates. Like, for instance, Peter Singer's principles are utilitarianism, do the best you can for the most people. That's a principle. That's the roots of an argument. And then as you take that out and expand it, it comes out and you get to see branches, different ramifications of it. And that's the same term for branches, and ramify is to branch out from an argument. If you truncate and radicalize somebody, you're cutting off those arguments and just leaving the kind of central stem. And to radicalize somebody means to drive them back to their roots, from the same Latin terminology that we use for roots, the radices. So to drive somebody back to their roots, to the principles, and to cut off the ramifications, that's an important idea in Varner's essay, because that's one of the things that is going on. That's an attempt to wedge people off from one another. So let's take this from the perspective of you think in terms of ecosystems. If you're a deep ecologist, if you're a Gaian theorist, a lot of modern environmental philosophy focuses on this concept of thinking of the land as a community, and you are just one part of it. Human beings are just one part of all that's going on. All the other animals, the wild animals, the domesticated animals, all this is something that we're participating in as one. And so if you follow Leopold's land ethic, or the deep ecologists, the land ethic, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Or the deep ecologists, biospherical egalitarianism. In principle, it's important that in principle, and that's a center point to Varner's argument we'll get to in just a minute. So if you follow that idea, then if there's biospherical egalitarianism, that means each part of it gets equal consideration of interests, right? And so for the animal rights activist who says, no, we can't kill off one species in order. We can't kill off an invasive species or an exotic species in order to save the native species and increase preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's an outsider, but from the perspective of an animal rights advocate, utilitarian, that is, you have to uphold what causes the least amount of suffering. So you can't just kill off an animal because it's part of a ecosystem that it's degrading or turning or harming. And a big part of this would be the question of whether human beings are part of this ecosystem and are harming it. So we talk about ecosystems a lot in this class. That's one of the ideas behind that, is that you're asking whether a deep ecologist with the concept of biospherical egalitarianism, or like Leopold, you're focusing on the ecosystem, on the health of a larger ecosystem, rather than on individual species. This is part of what we're talking about when we truncate and radicalize a person. If you're pushing a deep ecologist back to the point of biospherical egalitarianism, then you are going to have to think about every single aspect of the ecosystem. I think deep ecologists would say you should, and I agree with them largely. However, that's in principle, as Arnie Ness put it. It's in principle, which means that we do recognize that there are human values and that we have to uphold some of those. We're not going to begin denying food to large populations of people in order to save a species that is invasive into an ecosystem. And we might even have to make decisions, complex, hard ethical decisions about what we can and can't do. And the animal rights activists might say, if you're going to err in favor of one species, let's say it's a bald eagle that's a native species, highly iconic species, you're going to err in favor of that over, say, these frogs, let's say, that maybe are invasive, or some rat species that might be invasive. You're still going to be harming a sentient animal. And so that, in principle, if you're driven back to the radicals, the roots, then in principle you would say you can't do that. And so that's where this idea of the complex problem between the deep ecologist or the Gaian theorist, or an ecosystem focus on the ecosystem as opposed to the individual animals. So now on to wedge politics. There's a wedge. There's an image of one in Leopold's Sand County Almanac, in that great chapter on the good oak, and there's somebody splitting some oak, or I think it's oak, but maybe birch. I'm not sure. But anyway, that is a wedge. That's a splitting hammer, and there's a wedge. And those of you who heat with wood, as I sometimes do, you understand how the wedge works. There's the point of the wedge right there, okay? You drive the wedge into the round of wood. There's some more wedges. That's how you do it. So this is let's think of the round of wood as the thing that's held together, where people are in consensus. Let's say that is the group of people who agree about something. And yet you can find one place, if you can find one point where they disagree, if you go back, if you truncate and radicalize somebody, if you take off all of the ramifications of their argument and drive them down back to the roots, then you are leaving that person, you're pushing that person back to a place where they may not eventually want to be. So in wedge politics, what you do is you find the point. You find the point between two people. We also call this stasis. That's the place where two people disagree. If you can walk two people down a path together of thinking, and you could get them to agree about this thing, then agree about the next thing, and find the place where they go in two different directions, where one person says, no, I disagree with you about that, and somebody else says, yes, I believe you're right about that. You found the stasis point. You can see these all over the place in modern society and in modern political ideologies, places where we find people disagree about something, and using wedge politics is to drive that wedge in, which splits them, separates them apart from one another based on the point at which they disagree. So that's wedge politics. That's how it works. In the case of the article with Gary Varner, what he's pointing out is that people who are trying to drive animal rights activists and environmentalists apart are finding the place where they disagree rather than finding the consensus where they do agree. This is probably the most prominent form of political rhetoric that we find in our society today. And oftentimes, it's not even focused on reason or thinking, but it's more focused on emotion. You find a place where you can get one person to think of others who disagree with them about something in an emotional way, and you cause people to experience hatred and fear and the rest of that, instead of consensus and coming together to try to figure out how to solve problems. And as you could see in Gary Varner's essay, he points out that there are ways that we could convince utilitarian animal rights activists to do some of the same sorts of things that an environmentalist would do. That's the whole section at the end of his essay where he's talking about the different kinds of mini-ride programs and other ways that you could get people to see that you would actually cause more suffering if you allowed things to go to the extreme. An easy way for you to think about this, folks, is thinking like a mountain section of Leopold, where when they removed the wolves from the area, the deer population expanded radically and harmed the overall ecosystem. And the kind of thing that Gary Varner would say to a Peter Singer is, plus it caused a lot of suffering among those deer who were starving to death. And so that he can point out that there are ways you could get people to agree rather than finding the wedge, finding the point between them at which they disagree.